There stands, at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, a city unlike any other in human history. A city whose stones have been kissed by prophets, conquered by empires, and dreamt about by kings. A city where every alleyway whispers stories of angels and armies, miracles and massacres. Jerusalem. But on one day in the summer of 1099, this holy city, revered by three faiths, fought over for 1,000 years, witnessed a horror so vast, so sudden, so unrestrained, that even medieval chroniclers struggled to find words to describe it. A day when the sky darkened with smoke. A day when ironclad warriors stormed walls thought to be impenetrable. A day when a starving, desperate Crusader army, after 3 long years of marching, fighting, and dying, finally reached the very gates of the city they believed God Himself had promised them. And within hours, Jerusalem fell. Not after a week, not after a month, but in a single, unimaginable day. How did a weakened, disease-ridden Crusader force manage one of the fastest and most devastating captures of a fortress city in medieval history? What drove these warriors to unleash a fury so terrifying that even their own leaders later recoiled from it? And how did this one day reshape the Middle East for centuries? To understand the siege, the assault, and the violence that followed, we must step back into a world of faith and fear, of prophecy and ambition, of men who believed they were writing the final chapter of history itself. Because the fall of Jerusalem in 1099 was not simply a battle, it was a reckoning. And to understand why the Crusaders fought with such ferocity on that July morning, we must first understand what had brought them here, to this moment, this wall, this city. 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1096, tens of thousands of men, women, and children had set out from Europe, answering the electrifying call of Pope Urban II. They did not march merely for glory, or for plunder, or even for adventure, though for some, those motives simmered beneath the surface. They marched because they believed their souls depended on it. Urban had promised them absolution, a cleansing of sins through the holy work of liberating Jerusalem from Muslim rule. For the peasants, this was salvation. For the knights, this was divine purpose. For the princes, this was a chance to carve out new kingdoms under the banner of Christ. But the journey broke them. Along the way, their numbers shrank from the tens of thousands to a hardened core of perhaps 12,000. Hunger gnawed at them like a living thing. Disease hollowed their ranks. The blazing heat of Anatolia killed horses faster than they could be replaced. And the cities they captured, Nicaea, Antioch, bled them dry in battles of terrifying brutality. Yet still they marched. Because Jerusalem was not just a destination, it was a promise. And by the time they reached its walls, in June of 1099, they were not the army that had left Europe. They were leaner, more ferocious, unbreakable in their belief that God had preserved them for this moment. But Jerusalem would not yield easily. Its walls loomed high, its gates were shut, its defenders were prepared. The Crusaders had arrived at the end of their world, and the only way forward was through the holy city itself. Jerusalem in 1099 was a fortress sculptured from stone and faith. Long before the Crusaders appeared on the horizon, the city's defenders, led by Fatimid commander Iftikhar ad-Dawla, had taken no chances. They knew the Crusaders were coming. News had traveled swiftly across the Middle East after Antioch fell, and so Jerusalem was transformed into a citadel. The great walls were reinforced, towers were stocked with archers and stones, wells and cisterns were sealed to ensure water would last for months, and most critically, the surrounding countryside was stripped bare. Every tree within miles had been cut down. This was a defensive strategy as old as war itself. No trees meant no siege towers. No siege towers meant no breach. And no breach meant Jerusalem would withstand the Crusaders' storm. Inside the city, thousands of Muslims and Eastern Christians sought refuge, transforming Jerusalem into a tightly packed hive of fear and faith. The air carried the scent of cooking fires, sweat, and the whispered prayers of families who did not know whether rescue would come in time. For the defenders, this was not simply a military stand, it was a spiritual one. Jerusalem was sacred to Islam, the site of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the location of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest place in the faith. Its loss would be unthinkable. But the defenders had one advantage the Crusaders could not match: time. The Crusader army was exhausted, starving, and surrounded by barren land. With no food nearby and no reinforcements coming, every day that passed weakened them further. If Jerusalem could hold out a month, perhaps two, the Crusaders might simply break apart, collapsing in hunger and despair. Iftikhar ad-Dawla believed the walls would hold, that the city would endure, that the Crusader fire, so hot and bright, would burn itself out. He was wrong. By late June, the Crusader camp was on the brink of collapse. Water was scarce, bread was a memory, and the summer sun beat down on their tents with merciless fury. Some knights had begun to whisper that perhaps God had abandoned them. Others believed they were being tested like the Israelites in the desert, that only the faithful would see Jerusalem's gates open. But faith alone does not build siege engines. And with no wood for towers or battering rams, the Crusaders were trapped in a nightmare. They had reached the holy city, but they could not touch it. Then, on a morning that seemed no different from any other, a shout went up from the camp overlooking the Mediterranean. Ships! Dozens of them, their sails catching the wind like white wings. The Crusaders surged toward the coastline, hearts pounding, because they knew what this meant. Reinforcements. Not soldiers, but something far more valuable. Timber. The ships had come from Genoa, a maritime republic, whose merchants saw opportunity in the Crusaders' wishing. They brought engineers, tools, ropes, nails, and enough wood to create the engines of war required to break Jerusalem's pride. In that moment, the mood of the Crusader army shifted. Despair evaporated. Determination returned. Work began immediately. Under the blazing sun, men dragged massive beams across the dry earth. The sound of hammers echoed across the hills. Knights became carpenters. Priests carried buckets of water to cool the exhausted workers. Even nobles, men who had never lifted anything heavier than a sword, put their shoulders to the wood, because now they could see it. Victory, Jerusalem, God's promise within reach. Two massive siege towers began to rise, their wooden skeletons stretching higher each day. By the time they neared completion, they stood like giants above the Crusader camp, rough, creaking, and terrifying in their purpose. Jerusalem's defenders watched in growing alarm. The city that had seemed untouchable was now in danger. The siege they believed would last months might end far sooner. The Crusaders, revived by hope and timber, were preparing something terrible. In the summer darkness of July 13th, 1099, an eerie silence settled over the hills outside Jerusalem. The Crusader camp, usually alive with arguments, prayers, and the clatter of armor, was unnaturally still. The wind carried the scent of dust and sweat, mixed with something sharper, anticipation. For days, the siege towers had been rising like strange wooden monsters, taking shape through sweat-soaked labor and desperate faith. Now they stood complete, looming over the landscape like the instruments of fate. Inside their tents, the knights prepared for the morning as if preparing for their final judgment. Some knelt in prayer, clutching rosaries worn smoothed by years of marching. Others sharpened blades dulled by the sands of a dozen battles. Many wrote final words on scraps of parchment, leaving messages to families they had not seen in years, messages they feared would never reach home. Across the field, priests walked barefoot between the rows of tents, chanting Latin hymns that drifted like ghostly echoes through the night air. They spoke of Moses and Jericho, of miracles and deliverance. Their voices steadied trembling hearts. The Crusaders believed that at dawn history would pivot, that the gates of heaven or hell would open before them. Yet the defenders of Jerusalem also felt the weight of the coming storm. Inside the city walls, Iftikhar ad-Dawla surveyed his men. Seasoned archers from Egypt, infantry hardened by years of frontier warfare, and local fighters who had sworn to defend their homes. Torches flickered along the battlements, casting long shadows across the stone. The defenders tightened the ropes of their bows, prepared their mangonels, and wetted the hides draped over their towers to shield them from fire. Jerusalem was ready. The Crusaders were ready. Only the night stood between them. But then, something happened, something none of the chroniclers would ever forget. A procession began. Thousands of Crusaders, barefoot, unarmed, walked slowly around the walls of Jerusalem, singing hymns under the moonlight. They wept, they prayed, they begged God to open the gates. Even within the city, many watching could not help but feel the weight of the moment, the sense that something far larger than the armies themselves was unfolding. When dawn finally painted the sky in shades of gold, there was no turning back. The day that would become one of the most terrifying in Crusader history had arrived. At sunrise on July 14th, the great wooden towers creaked to life. The Crusaders pushed with all their strength, their shoulders braced against beams that burned hot under the rising sun. Wheels groaned, chains rattled, dust rose in thick clouds, and the ground seemed to tremble under the weight of these colossal engines of war. Jerusalem's defenders responded instantly. Arrows rained down from the walls like a storm of iron. Stones the size of ox skulls, hurled from mangonels, crashed against the towers, shaking them violently. Greek fire, sticky, burning oil, splattered across the wooden sides, igniting in furious bursts that sent Crusaders scrambling with water-soaked hides to smother the flames. Still the towers advanced. Inside the city, panic spread. The defenders had known these towers were coming, but not like this, not with such determination, not with such speed. And then came the moment that changed everything. The Crusaders revealed a deception. All week, the defenders had watched a huge siege tower being built in the southwest, near Mount Zion. They had concentrated their efforts there, reinforcing that section of the wall. But in the dead of night, the Crusaders had secretly dismantled the tower, carried its parts piece by piece across the hills, and rebuilt it in the north, right in front of the weakest section of Jerusalem's defenses. Now the true tower, the real threat, rolled toward a place where the walls were thinner, the towers shorter, and the defenders fewer. Iftikhar ad-Dawla realized too late what had happened. He sent urgent orders. Men sprinted along the parapets. Drums thundered. But momentum had shifted. The Crusaders sensed it. Their confidence surged. As the tower drew close enough for archers inside to fire down onto the battlements, the defenders' lines began to buckle. Shields splintered, helmets rang, blood spilled across the stone. Still the Crusaders pushed harder. The wheel struck the base of the wall. The tower shuddered. For one breathless moment it seemed it might tip over.
Then, with a deafening crack of wood and iron, the drawbridge slammed down onto the parapet. The Crusaders roared. The defenders braced themselves, and the battle for Jerusalem truly began.
The moment the drawbridge fell, chaos exploded across the northern wall. Godfrey of Bouillon, one of the Crusade's most respected leaders, was at the front, sword raised, his armor scorched by fire but unbroken. Behind him surged a wave of knights and infantry, climbing over the drawbridge and spilling onto the parapet in a frenzy of steel and shouts. Arrows fired at point-blank range tore into shields and armor. Men grappled hand to hand, slipping on the blood-slick stones. Spears thrust, swords clashed. The air filled with the metallic taste of battle, sweat, dust, and iron. Below, ladders slammed against the walls as more Crusaders climbed upward, desperate to join the assault. Some fell, struck by arrows or stones, tumbling backward into the crowd. Others made it to the top, only to be met by furious defenders, unwilling to yield even a single inch. But slowly, painfully, the Crusaders pushed forward. Every defender they drove back widened the breach. Every foot of wall they claimed created space for more attackers to surge through. And once a foothold was secured, everything began to unravel for the defenders. The Crusaders, hardened by 3 years of constant battle, fought with a terrifying intensity. Their desperation fueled them. Their faith intoxicated them. They believed this was the day the world would change, the day prophecy would be fulfilled. Jerusalem's defenders, though brave and disciplined, began to falter under the relentless assault. Then came the decisive moment. A small group of Crusaders found a narrow passage behind a tower, seized control of a gate, and flung it open from the inside. Suddenly, hundreds of Crusaders flooded into the lower city. Iftikhar-ed-Dowleh's men tried to regroup. Archers retreated through the alleys. Civilians hid in homes, shrines, and markets. But the walls had fallen. The Crusaders were inside. And Jerusalem, the holy city, the city of prophets, the city of kings, was about to endure its darkest hour. Once the walls were breached, the battle transformed into something far more terrifying. The Crusaders surged through Jerusalem's narrow streets like a tidal wave, driven by exhaustion, triumph, fear, and a burning sense of divine mission. After 3 years of suffering, starvation, and death, the sight of Jerusalem's gates broken open unleashed emotions too deep to control. Chroniclers would later describe what followed with language so vivid, so brutal, that medieval scholars still debate its accuracy. But one thing is certain. For the people inside Jerusalem, the next hours were a nightmare without shape. Crusader foot soldiers moved from street to street, clashing with pockets of defenders who refused to surrender. Fighting erupted near the markets, in courtyards, along stairways carved into the stone hillsides. The sound of steel striking steel echoed across the city like thunder. But soon, the fighting gave way to something else, a frenzy of killing and looting. Homes were forced open, shops were stripped bare, wealth that had been hidden for generations was dragged into the streets, and the streets themselves became rivers. Some Crusader leaders tried to restrain the chaos. Godfrey of Bouillon, horrified by the scale of the violence, is said to have ordered his men to show mercy, but few heard him and fewer listened. Raymond of Toulouse attempted to secure certain districts to prevent further bloodshed, but even his own men were swept away by the tide. In the Temple Mount, hundreds of civilians sought refuge inside the sacred Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Crusaders stormed it. One chronicler wrote that the blood there rose to the ankles, another said to the knees. Whether exaggerated or not, the message was clear. The slaughter was immense. Yet amid this horror, an extraordinary scene took place. A group of Crusaders, weeping with joy, threw down their weapons and climbed the steps of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. There they sang hymns, believing they had fulfilled God's promise, believing they were witnessing the end of history. Jerusalem had fallen, not after a month-long siege, not after a prolonged campaign, but in a single day, a day that would reshape the Middle East, a day that would ignite centuries of conflict, a day remembered not only for its victory, but for its terror. When the sun finally dipped below the western hills on July 15, 1099, Jerusalem lay silent beneath a haze of smoke. The sounds of battle had faded, replaced by a heavy stillness that settled over the city like a shroud. For the Crusaders, the day had been a whirlwind of triumph and terror, faith and fury. For Jerusalem's defenders and civilians, it had been a catastrophe of unimaginable scale. As night fell, the Crusaders began to take stock of what they had done and of what they had won. Godfrey of Bouillon, the man many believed to be the hero of the day, refused to be crowned king of Jerusalem. When offered the crown, he famously replied that he would not wear a golden crown where Christ had worn a crown of thorns. Instead, he took the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre, placing the Holy City not under his personal rule, but under the protection of God, at least symbolically. Around the city, Crusader soldiers set up makeshift camps near the gates and markets, exhausted beyond measure. Many simply collapsed where they stood, falling asleep on the stones still warm from the day's heat. Others wandered through the conquered streets in a daze, unsure whether to feel triumph or disbelief. But Iftikhar ad-Dawla, the city's commander, had survived. He negotiated with Raymond of Toulouse, who granted him safe passage out of Jerusalem. A procession of his remaining soldiers and attendants, bedraggled, wounded, yet dignified, was allowed to leave the city unharmed. For them, survival was the only victory left. In the days that followed, the Crusaders buried the dead, tended to their wounded, and attempted to restore order. Priests cleansed the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, purifying it with incense and prayers. Knights stood guard at the gates. Markets slowly reopened, though the city's population had been decimated. The Crusaders had achieved what they believed was a miracle, a victory ordained by God himself. Yet even in their moments of celebration, an uneasy truth whispered beneath the surface. They had conquered Jerusalem, but they did not yet know how vulnerable it was. The holy city had been taken in a single explosive day, but keeping it, holding it against the armies of the Islamic world, would prove to be a far greater challenge. The Crusaders' greatest triumph was already beginning to cast its longest shadow.
Jerusalem, once the heart of the Fatimid frontier, now became the heart of a brand new kingdom, a fragile, unlikely realm built atop the ruins of war. In the weeks following the conquest, the Crusader leaders gathered to shape the political future of the city. They divided the surrounding lands into fiefs, granted positions of authority to nobles, established Latin churches, and created a new legal system grounded in European customs but adapted to the unique realities of the Levant. Yet beneath the veneer of order, the truth was unmistakable. The kingdom of Jerusalem was born weak. Its population was tiny. Many of the original inhabitants were dead, displaced, or in hiding. Its nobles were few in number, many still recovering from wounds. Its borders were surrounded by powerful Muslim states, Egypt to the south, the Seljuks to the east, and various Syrian powers to the north. Still, the Crusaders believed they could hold what they had won. They restored the city's fortifications, repaired the damage to the northern walls, and set about reinforcing the Tower of David. Patrols began along the roads leading to Jaffa and Bethlehem. Envoys were sent to Europe, begging for settlers, soldiers, and supplies. Yet, even as they built their new kingdom, the memory of the siege lingered like a ghost. The defenders of Jerusalem had fought with courage, and their defeat had shocked the Muslim world. Word spread rapidly across Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Scholars, imams, and rulers reacted with a mixture of horror, anger, and determination. The fall of Jerusalem sent a message that echoed far beyond the holy city. A new, foreign power had risen in the heart of the Islamic world, and it was not going away quietly. Within months, distant rulers began preparing armies. Commanders studied the Crusader tactics. Scholars called for unity against the invaders. The Muslim world, fractured for decades, slowly began to shift toward a common purpose: reclaiming Jerusalem. Inside the newly conquered city, the Crusaders could not yet see the storm gathering on the horizon. For now they saw only their achievement, a city they had dreamed of, prayed for, suffered for. They had no way of knowing that the battle for Jerusalem was not over. It had only entered a new chapter, a chapter of survival.
The fall of Jerusalem in 1099 did not end with the Crusaders raising their banners over the city. In many ways, it was the spark that ignited centuries of war. Wars that would reshape the Middle East, Europe, and the world. Within a few years, armies from Egypt marched north in an attempt to retake the city. The Crusaders met them at the Battle of Ascalon and won, but the victory did not bring peace. Instead, the region descended into a constant cycle of raids, counterattacks, shifting alliances, and brutal sieges. The Muslim world, once divided, began producing leaders who would rise in response to the Crusader threat. Men like Zengi, Nur ad-Din, and ultimately Salah ad-Din, whose determination to reclaim Jerusalem would culminate in the famous events of 1187. But even as new powers emerged, the memory of 1099 weighed heavily on both sides. For the Crusaders, it became proof that God favored their cause, that divine intervention had granted them victory against impossible odds. Chroniclers wrote of angels fighting beside them, of miracles that had turned the tide. The story of the First Crusade became a legend told in castles, churches, and royal courts. For the Muslim world, 1099 became a symbol of loss, injustice, and the need for unity. Scholars wrote poems of sorrow and fury. Preachers called upon rulers to rise and reclaim the holy city. The massacre in Jerusalem became a rallying cry for generations. Both sides mythologized the day, and as the legends grew, so did the wars. Yet beneath all the stories, all the chronicles, all the embellished tales of glory or tragedy, one truth remains. Jerusalem fell in a single day because both faith and desperation pushed the Crusaders beyond human limits, and because surprise, strategy, and sheer brutality broke the city's defenses before it could adapt. The siege of 1099 stands as one of the most dramatic turning points in medieval history, a moment when religion, war, ambition, and survival collided in a way that still shapes the world. And the echoes of that day, the shouts, the prayers, the clash of steel, the cries of those who fled, have never fully faded. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most dramatic turning points, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next cinematic journey into the past. And tell us in the comments, which siege, battle, or forgotten empire should we explore next? Your suggestion might become our next feature.